Welcome everyone to this introductory session of the two-day long India Counter Dialogue on the United Nations Food System Summit. In 2019, the United Nations Secretary General announced that the UN Food Systems, or the UNFSS, will be held to transform the way the world produces, consumes, and thinks about food, putting the focus on realizing the Sustainable Development Goals. The UNFSS is scheduled to be held on 23rd September 2021. However, the UNFSS has garnered criticism for the control exercised by corporate lobbies, agribusinesses, think tanks, and big philanthropic organizations in driving the agenda of the summit. The course of the summit has been permeated with corporate influence to drive shifts in global food governance that threaten food sovereignty and security for large sections of marginalized and vulnerable populations. Accountability and multilateralism have been the centerpiece of the global food governance structure under the UN bodies since the post-Second World War period. Slowly and steadily, as nations gained independence, the concerns of the developing world started to gain traction, and the developed world was made accountable for its act in these international spaces. Over the years, there have also been reforms within the FAO and UN Committee for World Food Security to bring in more democratic engagements in opposition to the workings of the WTO, IMF, and other institutions of the new globalization era. However, with the UNFSS, there seems to be a dismantling of the democratic global governance order. We have our next speaker, Stefano Prato. Stefano is the managing director of the Society for International Development. He is based out of Rome. Stefano is an active member of the civil society and indigenous peoples mechanism working within the UN Committee for World Food Security. He has been a keen observer of the changes taking place within the global food governance architecture. He will be speaking on corporations and multilateralism. Basically, how corporations have been expanding their influence in global governance.
Thank you so much to the organizers for having invited me. I, of course, will take a sort of a global angle. Of course, you need to contextualize what I'm saying in terms of the global policy process, and I will leave to others to zoom into the particular situations, of course, of India. My role here is to speak about the dynamics of corporate capture and what we actually mean by them, and therefore to explain how this has provided a very fertile ground for an initiative such as the Food System Summit to emerge. And let me try and in the short time here available to provide a brief understanding on what are the different dimensions of corporate capture. I will start with a very brief macro view of the current global division of labor within the global economy and zoom in on the dimensions of corporate captures, providing some examples, and then portray particularly the role of the World Economic Forum and one initiative that it has been proposing and advancing to transform global governance and why this has been generated in many ways the premises that have then provided an impulse to the Food System Summit. So I'll go through 5 very quick steps, and hopefully you'll follow me. So my first comment is to take a bird's-eye view of the global economy, because sometimes when we talk about the food systems, we do it in a manner that is somehow isolated from what's happening around it. The reality is that the dynamics that have been shaping the evolution of food systems in most countries and globally need to be located within the particular global division of labor that emerged within the global economy with the advancements of the process of globalization and hyperglobalization after. And this has in many ways ossified structural inequality between countries thanks to a notion of specialization of countries, which have very often relegated the global south into the production of primary commodities and minerals, while the actual transformation has actually taken place elsewhere. And this is what has given the impulse to the global value chains, not only within food, but in basically all dimensions of the global economy, which has been thriving on this notion of specialization, delocalization, and has been really pushing for commodity dependence. And this state of affairs, in many ways, has created a situation where the structural inequalities between countries have actually ossified. And while in the global policy discourse, there has been a lot of focus on inequalities within countries, there has been an underestimation on how those inequalities within continue to be trapped by the inequalities between countries, and how these inequalities have generated economic and political elites, really in many ways recreating neo-colonial structures that are the ones on which the corporate capture also of food actually thrives. So it's important not to look at the corporate capture of food as an isolated, a distinct phenomena. It's something that actually characterizes most, if not all, domains of the global economy. And it is based on this ossified global division of labor and the economic and political elites, north and south, that it generates and it continues to feed. So it's important to locate it within it. And also, let's never forget that food systems are the core of most, if not all, economies. So it's really the cornerstones in many ways of these global division of labor. So that's in terms of the macro. Now, second point, but what do we really understand and mean when we talk about the corporate capture, and particularly the corporate capture of food? Well, the corporate capture of foods happens in four distinct dimensions or pillars. First of all, it's a capture of narratives, because corporations have been very smart in highlighting the urgency of the intervention, the grand narrative of the need to feed a starving planet. In many ways has been created and fed with the notion that this creates a sense of urgency that needs solutions, and very often this has led to a situation in which corporations have portrayed their own corporate solution as the savior of the day, being very careful in making sure that there is no analysis of the roots of the problems, because otherwise this would in many ways expose that most of the problems we are now confronting are actually engineered, are created by corporations themselves. So the urgency of the problem helps focusing on solutions and generates actually a discourse where every time you try to do an analysis of the root causes, you're losing time, because we need to be solution-centered. We don't want any more analysis. Why? Because the analysis would immediately expose the fact that the problems that corporations want to resolve are problems they themselves have generated. So first of all, it's a bit convoluted, in many ways, devil's smart approach to generate a narrative that pushes for solutions and try to hide the origins of the problem. Secondly, in order to do this, there's a need to capture evidence, because of course, the moment in which evidence generates a countervailing voice to that narrative, that becomes a problem. And this means to support the emergence of a narrowly group of mostly academic science, and therefore narrow the notion of evidence away from experiential realities, away from indigenous knowledge and traditional knowledge, away from a broad array of systemic understanding of our dynamics, into a group of corporate-friendly academic science. Very much the notion of the ivory tower, of academics, which in many cases are financed or support or closely interconnected with those very same corporate solutions. So the capture narratives is closely connected with the notion of capturing science and reducing science to formal, very often male, white academic science. The process is very closely developed with the notion of developing a new type of a so-called science policy interface, which will actually support this particular developments. And in many ways, this is driven by so-called techno-solutionists approaches, in which there is always a technological leapfrog or further steps that will resolve the problem that the previous step has generated. Now, so capture narrative, capture of evidence. Now, the third step is the infiltration of governance spaces. This happens extensively at all levels, not only globally, but also locally, nationally, and often initiates two processes of active consultation, because of maybe industrial transformation or industrial policy approaches, and then grows into the full participation of the corporate into the very policy making processes that they are supposed to regulate and their operations. And by doing so, immediately there is a shift of focus away from regulatory interventions into the old notion of normative and fiscal incentives. And this is the fourth step, the reorientation of policy, of programs, of resource allocation in order to favor normative decisions, fiscal intervention, incentives that would actually further advance those corporate solutions. So you see, these are the four dimensions very closely interconnected of corporate capture: the capture of narratives, the capture of evidence, the infiltration of governance, the reorientation of normative and fiscal interventions. Now, this all may sound a bit theoretical to some of you. So what are the concrete examples? And, I don't have time to elaborate extensively, but just let me give you a few. So for instance, one golden solution by the corporate is the notion of cheap food. Cheap food is portrayed as the solution to a starving planet, a solution to a lot of, undernutrition or structural inequality issues. The reality, we know very well that the other coin of cheap food is the dispossession of lands and resources, the marginalization of producers, and the amount of massive health, ecological, and socioeconomic externalities that food is based upon. But the corporate sector is very careful to make sure that there's no exposition, no analysis of those dynamics, and actually portrays the notion of cheap food as one of the savers of the day. Another very interesting example is the old notion of contrasting emerging health epidemics related, for instance, to the increase in many countries of overweight and obesity, and the resulting non-communicable diseases, which are diet-related. And once again, what is the response of the corporate food is the notion of so-called nutritious food, where the nutritious food tends to be the fortified industrial food, which once again is called nutrition or needs to be fortified precisely because the industrial process has reduced its nutritional qualities and its nutritional value thanks to this super hyper level of processing. And we know very well that most of the health dynamics actually are generated because of the level of processing, because of precisely this industrial production of food. But once again, the corporate sector has been very smart in portraying itself as the one contrasting, these health epidemics with, yet again, its own solutions, and is attracted massive fiscal and normative interventions. Think about all the impact on the labeling of food precisely in this direction. And third and last, imagine, how much, and we hear a lot of it these days, particularly in the COVID context, on how much the ecological crisis, which once again, it is generated largely by the massive biodiversity loss induced by corporate systems, the massive environmental disruptions and degradation. And once again, we see the corporate sector portraying itself with these very smart taxonomies on sustainable here and there, greenwashing their approaches to pretend to be, once again, the savers of the day. So this is an example on how the messaging, the manipulation of analysis and narratives have actually been portraying industrial solutions exactly to problems that industry itself has generated. Now, if this is a little bit the process, again, of capture narratives, evidence, infiltration of governance, and reorientation of normative and fiscal interventions, what is changing now? Because we've seen this happening for several times, for several years. Now, the reality is the World Economic Forum, this massive forum of industrialists, has decided to scale up the game, has recognized that it needs greater scale also in the capture governance, and have therefore conceptualized a plan which is called Global Redesign Initiative, which aim to transform governance multilaterally and therefore global governance in the direction of multi-stakeholderism. The notion that corporations are now bigger than many states and they themselves therefore have a capacity to govern the global economy, and along with state themselves. And this transformation on multi-stakeholderism means to actually change the nature of governance, which is still based on the notion of intergovernmental decision-making. How to do this? Well, reforming this system is going to be very laborious because it takes decisions by member states, and in many ways, we can still count on many to recognize that this is really not the direction to go. So the transition is now based on a new model, the idea of superimposing new structures that actually encroach and undermine existing institutions. So rather than reforming the United Nations, go through the whole discussion and decision-making process to change that model of governance, the idea is simply to materialize a new system on top of it, superimposed on existing governance dynamics, that therefore leads a reform without a reform, changes the system without a decision. So this is exactly, in many ways, what has been happening with the Food System Summit. And if you connect to the presentation of Michael, you understand how this is happening with a very nebulous super architecture. And why is it nebulous? It's nebulous precisely because the plan needs not to be overt, needs not to be explicit, because the moment in which explicit, it is easier to be fought. Now, some are saying, and this is where I conclude, again, the global redesign initiatives has been going on for quite some time, has been boiling in the background. Why this sudden upscaling of the process within food systems? Because what has happened over the past few years, that there has been the emergence of this new food system approach. And the food system approach as an approach that is recognized, even if it's in more conventional forms, that food systems do serve multiple public objectives. They are not only about producing food, they are about livelihoods, they are about our health, our relations with ecology, our cultural traditions, and many more. They embody gender dimensions in many ways. They ossify gender roles. So they're actually a locus of critical public policies and public investments, because they are actually the space in which we can meet so many different public objectives. So this narrative tends to reclaim food systems from the market-driven approach where they've been abandoned, and recognized that there is much more public interest into regulating food systems than we have claimed over the past years. And this is in open contrast with the notion of agricultural productivism that has actually led most food system policies over the past 2-3 decades. This has been seen by our corporate lobbyists as very dangerous. It's the emergence of a very dangerous paradigm, because while they can claim their solutions on a single space, on health, on ecology, the moment in which you connect the dots, it becomes immediately clear from a systemic analysis, the corporate food system is our cancer, is our disease. And this is where the World Economic Forum and its corporate allies have decided to do a preventive strike. The Food System Summit is a preventive strike to capture this emerging narrative of food systems, this emerging systemic, analytical, holistic approach to food, capture it from the very start, and by doing so, upscale the plans for this transformational governance by superimposing of the United Nations a different model, which is corporate-led. Consider that this is also a particularly critical moment. COVID has exposed the failures of global value chains, and in many countries has once again recognized that the ones that saved the day were local food systems, despite being heavily penalized, because in many countries we had the shutting down of the wet markets, of the territorial markets, but we actually have continued to invest on the large distribution channels. Despite this bias, local food systems have been critical during the pandemics, and many have recognized that there is much more to invest into local economies, into their resilience, in their development than global value chain. So it's a particular moment in which it was critical for the corporate sector to reaffirm the centrality of trade, of global value chains, of the model that they have been pushing for. So they saw this opportunity to capture once again the analysis and the narrative and redirect it towards corporate-led directions. But I think the real objective beyond this old narrative story, the real objective is really to recognize that this has been seen as a golden opportunity to do what I mentioned before, to superimpose a multi-stakeholder governance system with all its architectures, digital platforms, and all of these on top of existing multilateral institutions. And by doing so, leapfrog the transformation of the global governance, and particular global food governance system in that particular direction, therefore ossifying the role of corporations at the helm of the global governance system, and doing it without a decision, simply as a result of this very communication-led process that basically always uses important public objectives to the front, but in reality tries to mask the intent to really profoundly alter legitimate governance institutions. The dynamics of hyperglobalization has generated such powerful dynamics that when they impact our territories, it's very difficult to resist to them purely in that particular territorial struggle. It's a little bit like, you know, a river, you know, when you open a dam, no, like the energy is so big that there's very little downstream regulation that you can exercise. There's very little downstream resistance. You know, it comes with such an energy that it basically disrupts everything. So it's a necessity to engage in upstream regulations. It's a necessity to stop the origin of the flow. And this is where, unfortunately, we need to engage into a global resistance struggle that challenges and changes this dynamics from the very start. Because by the time they hit our territories, when they are already well formed, there's very little, unfortunately, that communities can do. This is a very sad reality. I have a very simple message. You know, global institutions are always, you know, from the view of resistance struggles, of food system struggles, global institutions are never good news, okay? And in front of all of these, the immediate response, as I said before, is to denounce them, boycott them, and get distance from them. I think this is exactly what some want us to do. I think we need to actually use this opportunity to reclaim that those institutions are ours. If I understand that the UN sometimes is undefendable, but if we lose the United Nations, the only democratic space anchored on human rights in which many societal constituencies have a right to participate, and that is still based on the notion of intergovernmental legitimate decision-making, if we lose that space, we're gone. So my feeling is, as much as all of this is challenging, the idea of contrasting and boycotting the Food System Summit is actually one to reclaim the United Nations we want, not to actually, you know, denounce the United Nations at all. You know, so I think it's important to understand this. We contrast this process because we need and want the United Nations according to their founding principle. This is, for me, the resistance struggle we all need to engage for. Thank you.